The introduction of Bioshock Infinite is my favorite part of the whole game. You have this surreal experience at this lighthouse purposefully mimicking the vibe of the first game. A mysterious pair leaving you in the storm with a vague objective. Bring us the girl, wipe away the debt.
What in the world is...
Next up, the Close Encounters light show and then the turbulent elevator ride making way to the golden splendor of Columbia. The eerie but inviting church, the baptism into the city, and then the city itself. There's all this beauty and liveliness, kids playing, people working, and the Beach Boys for some reason.
God only knows what I'd be without you.
You get this intimate look at the good parts of Columbia, all while getting whiffs of its rotten core. When I played this game for the first time back in 2013, I had so much anticipation to learn all the secrets of Columbia and conquer all of its systems just like I did in Rapture. And I think the reason this intro sticks in my mind so clearly is that despite the fun I had with Infinite, the game never really lived up to the excitement I felt in this beautiful intro. I enjoy Bioshock Infinite quite a bit. I think there's a lot of things that work really well in this game, and I welcome the excuse to play the recent Nintendo Switch port. But 7 years after its release, I still come away from it with the same conclusion. Infinite doesn't live up to the first two games. Why? Well, here's the simplest way to explain it. Bioshock and Bioshock 2 are immersive sims. Experiences where you explore a vast open map and are given agency in how you interact and exploit its various systems. Bioshock may not have been the deepest the niche genre had ever seen, but when it first came out, it blew players away with the amount of options and choice it provided. It was a game of exploration, experimentation, and lots of creativity on the player's part, assuming they learned the systems that made Rapture tick. To this day, it remains an iconic and important gaming experience. Bioshock Infinite is not an immersive sim, it's a first-person shooter. There is exploration, but only in a handful of spots to break up the mostly linear progression. There is experimentation and creativity, but a lot of it has either been simplified or funneled into your AI companion. Worse yet, Columbia simply lacks the interactivity found in Rapture. Where Bioshock 1 and 2 took its inspiration from Ultima Underworld and System Shock, Infinite feels closer to something like Half-Life and Halo, and to its biggest detractors, Call of Duty. True, Infinite retains many of its predecessors' features, and the player is given a certain level of choice that does make the game a lot of fun. But at the end of the day, Infinite is lacking much of the player agency that made the first two games classics. It's as if the ingredients for an amazing immersive sim are here, but for whatever reason something happened and the dish had to be changed. Sadly, this is due to Bioshock Infinite's troubled development. Irrational Games initially envisioned the third Bioshock to expand on every aspect of the formula. Columbia was meant to be an incredibly realized, open-ended world full of possibilities, intricate systems, and so much player choice. It could have easily been the next great leap in the genre, but alas, it was not meant to be. Years of delays, overambition, and frankly mismanagement put the third Bioshock in a dire situation. A situation that forced its developer to make major cuts. Enough cuts reportedly to fill up 5 separate games. Making for a title that had to settle with being a story-heavy first-person shooter with some immersive sim elements. At the end of the day, Bioshock Infinite fails at being the follow-up we hoped for. The core gameplay elements players fell in love with the original game are either minimized or missing altogether. And if you came to this review wanting to know how this game stacks up in the series, well, there was your answer. However, if we disregard its franchise and consider Bioshock Infinite for what it is instead of what it isn't, I think what we have in our hands, literally, is a solid, kinetic, and beautiful first-person shooter that offers a lot for the player to chew on in terms of its combat and eccentric, emotionally driven narrative. For the rest of this review, that's what we are going to focus on.
I'll see what else I can find!
Combat is the highlight of Bioshock Infinite, a bloody dance of raw firepower, superhuman abilities, and harnessing the space-time continuum, letting players eviscerate their foes in all sorts of fun ways. Compared to Bio 1 and 2, mobility is a greater focus, specifically the skyrail systems that wind through Columbia's districts. Jumping onto these with your skyhook lets you speed through the battlefield, giving you the high ground on your enemies for a hit-and-run attack, as well as more forward approaches. Zooming through the levels at the speed of death are among some of the most enjoyable parts of the game, made even better by the fact that the baddies can utilize them as well, making for some fun aerial combat situations. Another new addition to the combat is your shield. Represented by that yellow bar right there, the mechanic works just as you suspect. The shield absorbs all damage until it breaks, leaving your health vulnerable, forcing the player to take cover for a few seconds until it recharges. A pretty common mechanic for just about every shooter at the time that fits in nicely with Infinite, nudging the player to be a little more offensive and daring. The player can also choose to upgrade the shield along with their health and salts, adding a nice dab of strategy to the mix. Weapons are made up of the usual suspects: a pistol, shotgun, machine gun, and rocket launcher. Nothing new here, nothing bad here. New additions include a hand cannon that lives up to its name, a semi-automatic carbine that straddles that sweet line of long distance and short range, a volley gun which is like a rocket launcher light with a faster firing speed but shorter distance, and a crank-powered chain gun which is key for the mechanical menaces. Sniper rifles also make their debut, providing the range and firepower expected of them. A lot of the weapons have alternate universe variants as well. For example, the default machine gun fires automatically, whereas the Vox Populi variant shoots way slower but has way more of a punch. Same with the shotgun, whose alternate form is the one-shot heater, a blunderbuss type weapon that will turn these crazy Colombians into meat sauce. All in all, it's fun to shoot fools in Bioshock Infinite. The weapons feel hardy and powerful. I just wish I could carry more of them. A downgrade to the system compared to the previous entries is forcing the player to only hold 2 weapons at a time. This was a popular and frankly eye-rolling trend in shooters at the time, and it feels unnecessary in Infinite. Before each battle, you essentially have to guess which weapons you'll need, and it's kind of irritating when your equipment isn't up for the job. This choice was meant to incentivize more strategy and experimentation from the player and push them to better learn each weapon. It's a good thought, and yes, I will be the first to admit I have a tendency to stick to 1 or 2 weapons in Bioshock 1 and 2. But I would argue that letting the player carry the full arsenal and instead expanding the enemy variety would have been the more enjoyable route. That way you can design each enemy to have strengths and weaknesses to each of the weapons, compelling players to switch between their weapons more and discover these strengths and weaknesses for themselves. It's too bad we can't send a copy of Doom Eternal back in time to Ken Levine. Now, that's not to say Columbia doesn't offer some mean baddies to massacre, and yes, massacre is the appropriate term for this game. Despite not being deformed mutants, your combatants behave in a similar way to the splicers of Rapture. Bull-rushing melee types as well as gun-toting soldiers make their return, being your most common enemies. The flame-throwing firemen take the place of the grenade-throwing splicers, looking like the Iron Man Mark I but screaming like Obadiah Stane when they blow up. Tony! There's also the racist crow dudes. Similar to the Houdini splicers, they are able to teleport themselves around the map. A nasty pest easily dispatched by a good bucking bronco. More on that in a moment. But Columbia's most fearsome foes are the Iron Patriots and Handymen, 2 mechanical monstrosities whose high damage and high health make them the most challenging foes to face. Handymen in particular can be pretty overwhelming, pursuing the player relentlessly. Both of these enemies are meant to fill the role of the Big Daddy, and while I don't think they come close to being as iconic or intimidating, their inclusion is a welcome one and will keep players on their toes. Plasmids make a glorious return and are now called Vigors. These powerful potions grant the player superhuman abilities, giving them a much-needed edge in combat, only limited by the amount of blue salts you have to deploy them. Familiar but slightly remixed staples from the previous games return, like the electrocuting shock jockey and the burning devil's kiss. There's also the wonderfully gruesome murder of crows taking place of the killer bees. New additions include the bucking bronco, which blasts enemies up into the air, making them vulnerable to attack. And my favorite of the bunch is Return Descender, which collects incoming bullets and lets you shoot them back in a big nasty bullet ball. This one always makes me feel like some sort of anime supervillain. A nice bonus is that most of the Vigors can be deployed as traps, which is handy for some of the crazier end-game fights. The new Plasmids, or Vigors, are great additions to the formula, and it's still a lot of fun figuring out good combinations to get the upper hand on these buffoons.
No, it's me, Elizabeth.
The other major element to combat, and to the whole game in general, is of course Elizabeth. Looking like a Disney princess with a twisted fairy tale story to fit her, Elizabeth has been kept in a tower her whole life due to her ability to open tears to other dimensions and different points in time.
It's like a window. A window to another world.
Playing as Booker DeWitt, a former Pinkerton with a massive debt to settle, your overall objective is to get Elizabeth out of the tower and out of Columbia.
Are you real?
Real enough.
The relationship of Booker and Elizabeth is the heart and soul of Bioshock Infinite. While the story has its twists and turns and has a habit of inventing its own crazy rules to fit its postmodern meta-narrative, watching Booker and Elizabeth grow closer and begin to rely on each other provides enough emotional weight to let the story's more questionable aspects squeak by.
Bring us the girl and wipe away the dead.
In gameplay, Elizabeth is handy for picking locks, grabbing items, and reviving the player. But most notably, she can of course open tears in the environment, allowing the player to bring in helpful automatons, additional cover, weapons, and pickups, and even an Iron Patriot, assuming it's available to you. Elizabeth can only keep one tear open at a time during combat, so in the midst of battle, the player is constantly choosing what they need in that moment. Is it better to have additional cover, or is the mobility afforded by the skyhooks more beneficial? Should we have the Iron Patriot backing us up, or does it make more sense to bring in a barrel of sniper rifles to eliminate enemies from afar? This adds a nice layer of choice to the combat and, if we're being honest, compresses several of the original game's plasmids and mechanics into one context-based system. Is this Elizabeth system as fun or satisfying compared to the original games? Nope. Sorry to beat a dead horse again, but the mechanics of Elizabeth is where you see one of the major disparities between Infinite and its two prequels. Elizabeth's tears within combat are predetermined by the developer, whereas in the original game, the player was able to create their own combat advantages. Agency, remember? We don't need to hypnotize the Iron Patriots like the Big Daddies because Elizabeth can just summon one when you need it. We don't need to hack turrets or drones because Elizabeth can summon them when they are available. It was a lot more satisfying to work for this stuff instead of doing it with a button press when the combat scenario allows it. But once again, if we focus on what Infinite is instead of what it isn't, this system is still enjoyable, and I have to say the split-second choices I make in combat keeps the gunplay dynamic and engaging right up until the final battle. A little disappointing, but still a lot of fun.
It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no millionaire star. No.
One area where Infinite does live up to its predecessors is its presentation and storytelling. Irrational Games absolutely outdid itself in bringing Columbia to life. Where Rapture was a cold, dark graveyard of a once beautiful city, Columbia is a warm, bright, and lively utopia. Jutting into the soft blue skies are beautiful colonial-style buildings surrounded by lush greenery and patriotic monuments. It's all a physical manifestation of American exceptionalism and how such a philosophy can give way to human savagery, hatred, and eventually rebellion. Where Columbia is alive and thriving at the beginning of the game, its latter half contrasts this with a dying city bleeding out into the streets. Also, the sheer amount of media created for these environments is simply staggering. Posters, music, kinescopes all do an excellent job of translating the culture of Columbia to the player, and of course, the audio logs make their return in the form of voxophones. Each are written and performed splendidly, and while the practicality of them is still questionable, they still do an amazing job of fleshing out Columbia's citizens and villains.
DeWitt. We called him the White Engine of Wounded Knee for all the grisly trophies he claimed.
Music is also a standout. Composer Gary Skyman returned to create a soundtrack that is abrupt, frightening, and motivating, flavoring the game's action sequences appropriately, but also complementing the game's slower, quieter parts as well.
Is a better home awaiting in the sky.
But what of the Switch port? Well, like the ports of Bio 1 and 2, Infinite aims for 30 frames per second, 1080p docked, and 720p handheld, and generally succeeds at keeping everything locked. I don't think this port is quite as stable as the previous two games. I definitely noticed a lot more frame dips compared to those ones, but the game was still perfectly playable throughout, and if you're jonesing for a good shooter on the go, it's hard to go wrong with this one.
Will the circle be unbroken?
My recommendation for Bioshock Infinite really depends on your expectations. If you're hoping for a game to fully expand and move forward the iconic gameplay systems found in Bioshock 1 and 2, you will be sorely disappointed. But if you're hoping for a strong first-person shooter with a wacky but emotional story and combat that is full of spectacle and options, then yeah, Bioshock Infinite is a great play, especially with this decent Switch port. I absolutely wish we had gotten the game Irrational initially envisioned, but at the end of the day, you have to give them props for at least reining everything in and getting a product out there that was polished and fun, despite not being what everyone was hoping for. But hey, what do you guys think? If you have any thoughts on Infinite or where you think the series is heading, be sure to let me know in the comments. I really want to see them. If you enjoyed this video, would you kindly click on that like button and consider subscribing? It is a huge help in my fight to appease the all-powerful algorithm. I post videos every Thursday, so be sure to ring that bell so you are the first to see them. I'm Kirk, and thank you for watching this video. Stay safe out there.